Okay, timing. That's generally the next biggest question is, when do I prune? Okay, and I've tried to categorize it a little bit, and obviously it's a little vague because there's millions of plants out there, and there's, I promise you, an exception to every rule. Okay, but pruning in general, for deciduous things, which means things that lose their leaves, anytime when they're dormant, which is from about September to about April. Okay, they lose their leaves, the plant's dormant. Okay, for most of those plants, you can prune in that time frame. That's a pretty big window of opportunity to get your pruning done. Okay, evergreens, okay, prune from early spring to midsummer. Now, the reason you don't prune evergreens in the wintertime is if we have a hard winter like this and you just take away their outer foliage, it's like taking the coat off of a plant and sticking it out in the cold. And now it's going to be prone to damage and winter kill. Okay, so you leave the foliage on it till it's about spring. Then you can cut what you want to cut, and it's going to flush out with new growth in the spring because it was going to do that anyways. Okay, so now by doing it early spring, you don't get that flush, and then you go cut the flush off and it's got a reflush, so you don't set the plant back any. So you cut it right before the first flush, so the new flush comes out with all new growth for you.
So what time frame? Like April to?
As early as mid-March, depending on how the winter is. Last year you didn't want to start evergreens till April. This year we'll see. You know, I think it's going to be about the same. But normally around here it's pretty mild. You can do evergreen pruning early to mid-March for things that are not blooming in the spring. So you want to stop evergreen pruning midsummer. Okay, and there's good reason for that also. Particularly if you're pruning hard. Okay, the harder you prune, the plant has to have time to regrow and recover. Okay, midsummer plants essentially go dormant to a certain extent. They slow their growth rate down to accommodate the difference in heat and drought, which we typically have. So that heat and that drought tends to slow a plant's metabolism down. Okay, so if you're pruning hard at that time of the year when the plant's barely growing, how long is it going to take for it to recover? It's going to be much longer. Okay, so if a plant's in the spring and you prune it, it's going to bounce right back. But in the summertime, it's going to be much slower. So it's got to put out new growth. That new growth has to be sufficient enough to cover or resuscitate the plant, and it also has to have time to harden off before winter comes in. Okay, so your growth rate is going to be much slower in the summer, late summer. So you're only going to get a little bit of growth. You might get a little more in the fall, but it's still going to be pretty tender, and you need for that to harden off before the actual winter sets in. And depending on when winter sets in around here, normally, you know, you still got a couple months. But so midsummer should be when you stop. As far as time-wise, things that bloom in the spring, evergreen or deciduous, wait till they're done blooming. Okay, so if you have azaleas, wait till they finish. Anything that's going to bloom in the spring, forsythia, wait till it's finished blooming. Anything else that's blooming in the spring, wait till it's done. Then you've got a group that's going to be blooming in summertime. Summertime, most of those bloom on new wood. Okay, so you can prune them prior to summer, and then when they flush out, they'll bloom on the new growth anyway. So it doesn't affect them as far as their blooming and performance goes. So those you can prune in the spring also. And then there's a few things that are odd, like some evergreens that bloom early summer, like gardenias. And gardenias is the one that people usually ask me about. Gardenias have set their buds already. So if you prune them in the spring, you're cutting off the flowers. Okay, so you tend to have to wait for them to bloom, which for the most part is June. So after June, you want to try to get them as quickly as you can because you're going to rapidly hit that summertime when metabolism is going to slow down. And so you want to get that pruning done as quickly after bloom as possible. Camellias are kind of the same way. They finish blooming about April or so. So as soon as you got about a month or 2 months after that, you want to get your pruning done before they set buds. Otherwise, you may miss bloom for next year. You cut them off much later than that. Did I miss any? Rhododendrons would be like azaleas. Get them after they bloom. Actually, rhododendrons are azaleas. Azaleas are rhododendrons really in that family. Okay, early spring, midsummer, spring before bloom. For summer bloomers, spring after bloom. Pinching I didn't mention. Pinching is really for a certain number of perennials, and what pinching does is it increases the number of branches. Or you have hibiscus. When they first flush out, if you don't pinch them, they will tend to get tall and leggy, and by the time they bloom, they'll tend to either be flopping over or they'll end up 6 feet tall. If you pinch them when they first start sprouting for the first month or so, you get double the branches every time you pinch one. So from 1 goes to 2, from 2 goes to 4, from 4 goes to 8. Okay, so each time you pinch it, you get more branches. The more branches, the more buds. Okay, so instead of having 3 stalks with 2 flowers each on a hibiscus, you could have 12 stalks with three flowers each. Which one's going to make a better show? Obviously, the one that was pinched. Lantanas, yeah, you can, yeah, because they're a summer bloomer.
Right.
You know, so sure. The other thing with that is if you didn't pinch it, like I said, it was going to get tall. In the case of mums, they have a tendency to flop over. If you pinch them, they stay shorter and dense and just get massive blooms. Now, the other thing difference pinching will do is, and I'll get this somewhere in there. There's a comment for disc budding. It's just the opposite of disc budding. Pinching creates more bloom, which means flowers are smaller. You get more of them, but the flowers are smaller. If you disc bud means, let's say you have a camellia that's got 3 buds on the branch, and I take away 2 of them and just leave 1. All the energy that was going into those 3 is now going into 1, so therefore it gets bigger. Therefore the flower's bigger. Rose Society, camellia societies, they do that when they want to enter flowers in a show all the time. So that way they make their flower more impressive. Crepe myrtles, when you prune crepe myrtles, if you take all the little twiggy stuff off and just leave the main branches, the blooms come out much larger, and far more dominant. Whereas if you don't prune it at all, you get lots of blooms, but they're actually smaller blooms. But, you know, if a tree gets bigger, you know, you can't really, all you notice is it's blooming. If you look closely, you'll see the difference. So,
But you don't like the murder of the crepe.
don't like the murder. We'll get to that one too.
Knockout roses.
Knockout roses? Okay, roses. I didn't mention roses. Roses, typically you want to prune them usually about the end of February. And particularly when we have a hard winter like this, if you have big canes, when you cut a rose, sometimes the cane is a little hollow. And an old trick rosarians used to tell me is take some Elmer's glue and pour inside the cane. That keeps water from getting down in there, keeps it from freezing and splitting the canes. So, I mean, you can do that to seal up the ends of your rose bushes, and that helps protect them a little bit. But normally, February, end of February, or this year it might be early March, is still fine. You want to get them while they're still dormant. Okay, well, unfortunately, we've already cut all ours back when we moved them into what used to be the greenhouse. And that collapsed in the snow the other day. So
How low do you prune down?
you can prune roses very hard, actually. Roses, you can take them down 12 inches, 18 inches from the ground, somewhere in that range. If you have a really, really big one, maybe you go a little bit bigger than that. But it doesn't hurt to prune them back hard. Now, the one thing that we're going to get to also in the discussion is how to direct and control growth. Okay, and what you'll have is, this is an example of buds. These little points would be the buds on a branch. Okay, there's 2 types. One, the buds are opposite, like this one here, or like this one here, I mean. That means the buds are equally on both sides of the branch, and then they rotate, and then they rotate back. Okay, so you have leaves or buds opposite, directly opposite itself on the branch. And then alternate is this other method where you've got a bud and then a bud and then a bud, and it kind of circles its way around, moving up the branch. Okay, I like alternate better, but plants are what they are. Hollies, I believe, are opposite. So when you cut a holly above its bud, you get 2 branches because there's 2 buds there. When you cut a plant that is alternate above its bud, you get 1 branch because there's 1 bud there. Okay, now how do you control direction of growth? You cut above the bud that's pointing where you want to go. So let's say I have a tree with a branch here, a branch here, and a branch over here, and I need a branch over here. I'm going to cut this branch and this branch to a bud pointing this way here to help fill in the middle. Okay, and it takes a little longer. You know, it might take a couple years to actually fill in, but once you get the branch going there, you can see how it works. And that will work. That will be the dominant bud every time. Okay, and this will be the dominant bud. Now, you want to cut it back further? You know, if I was to cut above, if I was to cut above this branch, this bud right here, where is that branch going to go? It's going to go up and it's going to run into this branch, isn't it? Okay, so we like for the buds to be on the outside. I'd rather cut above this one, that one right there, so that this becomes the dominant branch away from the center. Okay, we'll talk more about that as we go too.
And you just pop off the other bud?
You don't necessarily have to. Sometimes, depending on how hard, the harder you cut something, the more flushes it's going to have. If you just take a little bit, then you get less on there. And these buds will lay dormant until they're stimulated, basically. So they may or may not flush out. It just depends on, let's say, how hard you cut it.
I think it's yours. It's not mine.
Yes, you can. Yeah, you can. And Typically speaking, with roses, they like for you to cut it down where you still have 3 sets of buds on the stem, and then cut above that. And with roses, just like with crepe myrtles and other things, you want to direct the growth to an outward direction. Roses in particular have disease problems. Excuse me. So if you have open air circulation in the middle, you have less problem with disease. But yes, you can reduce size like that anytime. And, you know, come midsummer is probably time to wait for, let it finish out in here. Okay, some natural tree shapes. And I include this in here because so many people that prune don't realize what's natural and what isn't, and they square plants, which nature doesn't grow that way. So I have that comment in there. But natural shapes, oval is a natural shape. There's a lot of plants that are essentially oval. Rounded is a natural shape, basically a rounded shape. Of boxwood is pretty much rounded, for example. Mounding, and azalea would be considered a mounding plant. It kind of billows over, kind of like so. It's just kind of mounding as it spreads out. Globe or globular would be round. I think a globe is round, like the earth. Globe shaped is a plant that's round, and there's plenty of those. Some of the arborvitaes are round. Spreading, prostrate, and creeping all mean the same thing. It's basically growing horizontally. But the difference between the three is creeping is something that's laying close to the ground, very low in stature. And prostrate is something that would be a little bit taller, might be 6 inches to a foot tall. And spreading could be anywhere from there to 3 feet tall, but it has that horizontal spreading habit. So they're different terms for the same thing, basically. Columnar is something that's growing essentially straight up and down. Sky pencil holly, a good example. It's about 16 feet tall and about 3 foot around. Okay, but it grows like a column, like a pencil. That's the name. Pyramidal, wrong line. Upright, basically anything that grows more tall than it does wide. Lots of things fit into that. Vase shape. Typically a crepe myrtle is vase shape. It's narrower at the bottom and it fans out at the top, so that would be vase shape, but that's a natural shape. And then umbrella shape you don't see quite as much, where you have this canopy that looks sort of like an umbrella. There's used to be China berry, Texas umbrella tree was the example I used to use, but it's kind of a weedy tree. You don't see it a whole lot anymore either, which is probably fine. Conical and pyramidal are my favorite shapes for plants. They tend to be upright and pointy or upright and rounded, okay? But they're upright, and I'll show you in a little bit why I like that shape the best. Palm tree, I think most everybody knows what a palm tree looks like. Basically a stem with big fronds that hang over the top, very tropical looking. And then weeping. And weeping habit is anything that's going to be cascading back down to the ground from whatever height it may start at. And then square, again, is not a natural plant shape. Some person made it that way, unfortunately. And we'll try to get you out of doing that. Okay, so now we're down to the basic info section, which is really where, in a sense, now that you know some of the other stuff, it's kind of where you start when you go to pruning. And the first thing I tell you is to evaluate your plant, okay, and evaluate it for selective removal, not random like that guy. Selective. You handpick what you want to cut, okay, and you do that through observation, and you do that through evaluation. You step back and you look at the plant and say, okay, what is the key components of this plant? What are the things that are wrong with the plant? The things that you would want to look at, crossing over branches. Crossing over branches, usually a branch that comes from the one side and crosses over to the other side, or crisscrosses another branch in any direction. Okay, they are a problem. Partly, one in case of something like a rose would be airflow and cause disease and stuff like that. But it's a structural weakness because the branches somewhere along the way they're going to cause rubbing. And that rubbing is a wound, and that wound leaves available opportunity for insects to invade or for rot to occur, okay? So crossing branches are bad. Duplicate branches. If you have two branches going in the same place, eventually they're gonna, as they get bigger, they're gonna either gonna grow together or they're gonna crisscross each other left and right because there are two branches in this place where one will do fine. So you take out the weakest. Stuff like that. Damaged wood, cut out anytime. Damaged wood needs to go away. It's just a place for insects to invade. And you will also find that if you have a plant with a dead branch in it, as long as you leave that dead branch in it, it's not going to fill in. But if you cut the dead branch out and let the air and the sunlight back in there, then the plant starts to fill in. But you can leave that dead branch in there and it's going to stay looking dead for a long time. It just doesn't want to recover that because there's something occupying that space. So remove what died and then it'll start filling in. Okay, now we're going to talk about some of these illustrations here. The first one is a branch collar. And a branch collar, and I get to thank one of my customers for this sample here. But a branch collar is the fattened part of a branch where two branches join together, okay? If you look where the smaller branch attaches to this, you see it's kind of swollen, a little fat, right at the base of it where they connect. That's your branch collar. And you want to cut right above this branch collar on the same angle that the branch collar is, okay? Same angle makes the cleanest cut. That branch collar has all the genetic information it has, or that it needs rather, to close the wound, okay? If you cut outside the branch collar, the wound is as small as you can make it, so the wound's going to heal as fast as is feasibly possible. Now, what if you cut off the branch collar? Okay, I want a nice smooth cut, so I'm going to cut all the way down, cut it to the quick, so to speak. Okay, I take that branch collar away. Now, my cut is twice as large, and I don't have that genetic material anymore to cover the wound. So now it's going to make a new branch collar before it can close that hole. So in the meantime, you're likely to get dye back in there or a place for insects that can invade. Okay? So cut just outside the branch collars. Another thing on this example here, if you have a large branch that you want to take off and it's got some weight on it, okay, you may not know how much weight, and it's very deceiving how heavy a branch can be once you get way out there with some leverage on it, okay? So there's what we call a three-cut rule. The first rule is you cut on the bottom, that takes tension off of the branch, okay, so that when you cut through it, it doesn't peel the bark all the way down the tree stem, okay? So that eliminates that. Just enough cut to keep it from peeling that bark. Then you can cut it off. Now, obviously, you've left the nub here, which is not good because nubs, I cut a lot of these off yesterday, but nubs die back. Okay, if you leave nubs, they die back instead of, sometimes they sprout like some of this, but they die back, and that's places where rot can occur. It takes longer to heal the wound because there's a dead piece of wood in the way, so it can't close up, okay? And of course, insects again can invade. Okay, so the third cut on this large stem is once you take all that weight off of it, you just got a little nub there, it doesn't have much weight. Now you can cut clean through it right above the branch collar. And you can see the branch collar is kind of drawn in here. You're cutting at the same angle as the branch collar, just outside of it. Generally as close to it as you can get without cutting into it, okay? Now, let's say I needed to cut the top of this tree off right above this limb, and maybe that limb's fine. You see this line right here is called a branch ridge. And it's really hard to see in some cases. Let's see if I can find one for you here. Not so good. It's not so much in the sample here. But a branch ridge, basically it's a line that you will find, let's say the trunk is right here, there'll be a line kind of perpendicular to this branch, okay, and that branch collar or branch ridge would be the same as the branch collar, except that it's in the middle of the tree. So if I wanted to cut this, I would like to cut right above that branch ridge, okay, and then that's how you reduce the height on that thing, and then that will sprout from there, or in this case, if this limb was not removed, it would take off. So on pruning alternate, you prune above the bud, that directs the growth. If you have an opposite pruning, you're going to get two branches, okay, you're going to get two branches on that one. Cutting off double leaders. One thing you will find, if you have this is not a real good tree looking here, but what I'm trying to get here is that a tree with a strong right angle branching habit is strong. Like oaks have a tendency, their branches are perpendicular to the trunks. Okay, those are strong. They don't break up in windstorms, they last forever. Then you have trees like Bradford pears, maples, that the branches grow very much upright. You have a very narrow crotch, less than 90 degrees. Those narrow crotches are far more susceptible to breakage. It is far easier to take leverage and snap that down than it is from one that's out here. You try and pull it up, that's going to hold itself. Okay, so this is far more damage. So good branching habit, weak branching habit. So when we get to a tree with a double leader, you've got that weak branching habit where the two leaders are formed. You have a crotch. That crotch is a place where leaves can collect, which will collect moisture, which will cause rot, okay? And you're susceptible to one of them breaking off at some point if the particular storm comes along that does that. So you choose the weakest of the two to remove, the strongest and straightest you would save, and then you cut off the double leader so that you have one single trunk. That is structurally the best thing for the tree. And it's best when you do this stuff when the plants are small. It's a lot easier to get to, it's a lot easier to do, and you improve the structure of the tree from when it's basically a child, okay? Okay, this is an example of thinning. Okay, you have a tree and you want to thin it out. Let's say it's too dense, and so what you're looking for is, well, actually thinning and reducing. They're kind of opposite in this diagram. If you look at the orange marks here, this would be reduction. You're taking the outsides off, okay, and that's closing up the tree. But one thing you're trying not to do is change the structure of the tree. So you still have a leader, you still have your basic branching habit going, okay? You just removed the extended growth to shorten it up. Okay, now it's going to sprout again from these other branches, and it won't miss a beat because you didn't take these tips away. They're still there, okay? If you were thinning, a little better diagram for thinning might be this one here. This is where you have duplicate branches, two branches going in the same place. You take one away. You have two branches up here. You take the weakest one away, let the strongest one grow. Case like a Bradford pear where you get lots and lots of branches coming up there. You take every other one out. See, Bradford pears and pears in general have a floriferous amount of branches in a small place. If you've ever seen a 2x4 or a piece of wood and it's got a lot of knots in it, okay, those knots were branches at one time. Okay, and if you have a lot of knots in a wood, what do you think about that wood? It's going to be weak in that spot, right? The wood's going to break or things like that. Same thing is true in the living wood of a tree if it has all those knots in the same place. Pears are notorious for that. That's why they break up in storms. Partly because they have a weak branching habit, partly because they have way too many branches at the same spot. So in a storm, they have a tendency to peel the branch down when it has a little size and weight and leverage. Two, I've seen those things in a good storm, simply twist the tree off and snap it right off, right there, where all those branches meet. There's too many weak spots all in one space. So when pears, if you have pears, try to thin them out a little bit as they grow. They still are going to grow pretty tight. Even the newer varieties are still a little tight. But try to thin them out a little bit, and that will help them a whole lot as they get older. Okay. Topping of trees. Topping of trees is a bad deal. Okay, it totally destroys the structure of a tree. You should have a tree with good structure. Okay, when you take a top of a tree like this is what you get the growth out of it. Okay, half of those branches are going to break because they have weak crotches and there's too many. It's just like the scenario with the pear on the other page. Okay, half of those are going to break in a storm. It's going to look like crap. It's going to look like this in the wintertime, an ugly bunch of nubs up there. And depending on what tree this is, it may not even survive at all. If you do this to an oak, for example, which is very slow growing, 90% of them don't come back. They die. So that's the case where pruning could kill something. Maples and stuff like that, they will recover. They will bounce back, but it's a weak tree now. It's got a poor structure habit. Okay, this practice, as far as I know, was originated back in colonial days. Okay, when the colonists needed firewood. They were here, they were settling, they didn't have much at the time, they needed to stay warm in the wintertime, so they went and cut some trees to make firewood. Okay, we don't have to do it for that same reason, not that we don't buy firewood nowadays, but we don't have to go top trees to do that. Okay, this is a bad practice. So if you see somebody in your neighborhood do it, shake your head, maybe you can explain to them why it's not good. But if the guy comes around to your door and knocks on your door sending packing, don't let him do that to your trees, because it's bad all the way around. So.